Paris above ground was the life they had planned, a city of bridges and cafes and rings laid on velvet, a place where friends sent postcards and people kissed without lowering their voices. Below ground was the secret they shared, a second city, older than the bright one, honeycombed out of limestone and habit, a network of tunnels so long that no one had ever measured them with certainty. In the spring of 1995, Claire Fournier and Marc Dubois decided to bring those two Parises together, to carry their love into the dark and pull from it an image worthy of the invitations they were about to send. Claire had the camera. Mark had the maps. Between them, tied on a thin cord in his pocket, were two simple wedding bands, the color of afternoon sun on the Seine. They met at the university by accident, or at least that is how they told the story when friends asked for the 10th time. A lecture on the hidden infrastructures of the city, sewers, conduits, quarries, had spilled its audience into the hallway, and Claire had dropped a roll of film that unspooled like a ribbon across the tiles. Mark bent to help and said, half grinning, "You can tell Paris by what it hides." He meant it as a clever line. She heard it as a thesis. Their first walk after that took them not to the postcard Paris, but to the edges where the streets dipped, and you could feel the ground hollow out beneath your feet. Claire's mother said she had never been a child who liked easy light. She grew up making pinhole cameras out of boxes and foil, fascinated by how darkness could be made to yield an image if you invited it gently enough. She loved the faces of strangers on the metro, the way neon smeared on rain, the tiny formalities of shadow. Mark, for his part, loved plans, the sheets of paper that held cities at a scale you could tame with the span of your hand. He drew lines for pleasure, water lines beneath a boulevard, ventilation lines inside a museum, pedestrian flows between a school and a bakery at 4 in the afternoon. If Claire collected moments of light, Mark collected routes that made sense. By the time they were 25, they had an apartment near Montparnasse with a small kitchen and a balcony that emitted more noise than sky. They had Sundays in the Luxembourg Gardens and a pair of used bicycles that never seemed to be in perfectly repair. In April of that year, Mark proposed with a ring that was not expensive, but was exactly right, and Claire said yes so quickly they both laughed. The plan was a modest wedding in the autumn and a photograph for the invitation that would be theirs alone. Claire wanted candles. She wanted the walls of bone, not the macabre shock of a chamber of death, but the formal, strangely tender geometry of the ossuary where skulls and femurs had been stacked like a kind of architecture. Eternal, she told Mark, tapping the lens against her palm. A joke against death that isn't a joke. Friends advised cafes instead. Parents advised patience. But the idea had its own gravity, and the catacombs had been whispering to them for years. They were not cataphiles, those devout explorers who knew the forbidden network like a second set of streets. But they had read the books and listened carefully to the men who smoked and spoke too fast outside of Denfert-Trochereau. They knew where the official entrance stood and, more importantly, where the unofficial ones might be. A service hatch with a broken lock on a quiet street. A manhole whose bolts had mysteriously loosened themselves. A maintenance door that opened because someone didn't want to be the kind of person who keeps doors shut. On May 12, 1995, a Friday, they packed the way people pack who want to be careful but believe nothing truly bad will happen when they are careful. 2 headlamps, extra batteries, a coil of cord for the tripod in case she needed to hang the camera and take a long exposure, candles, tapers and tea lights both, waxed matches sealed in a tin, a thermos of coffee, a liter of water, a paper map photocopied from a book every cataphile swore was out of date, and Mark's small compass that would be useless if he lost the ability to trust its needle. Claire wore jeans and a jacket that fit like she had owned it through a dozen winters. Mark wore the expression of a man who has decided not to let fear make the decisions he is supposed to make. He slipped the cord with the rings into his pocket, looped once around a belt loop out of habit, as if love ought to be fastened to the body. A neighbor on Rue Darrow smoking on his balcony noticed them because they looked too cheerful to be thieves and too intent to be lost. He saw Claire unclip a small padlock and slip into the gap behind a gate, Mark following with the kind of caution that makes a man turn his head twice even when he has decided to go forward. The neighbor thought about calling someone and then did not. It was Paris. People were always slipping into versions of the city other people didn't use. Their plan, if plan is the word for what lovers call a plan, was to drop into a well-known section, follow a corridor to an ossuary Claire had marked with a star, take a few photographs, and leave with a sense of triumph. The tunnels felt larger in their mouths than they did under their feet. The air had the wet smell of stone that has been sweating for centuries. Their lamps caught names carved on walls, dates from the 19th century that seemed to prove that time had been collecting here like condensation. Claire loved the grain the damp gave to the light. She loved the way the flames of their candles made Roman numerals dance. Mark loved that the passages obeyed some order he could sense more than see. The quarries had been cut in a logic of extraction, and logic is a comfort even in the wrong place. The catacombs beneath the city are not one coherent thing. They are a palimpsest, medieval quarries widened by later hands, official inspections marked by stone plaques, wartime shelters grafted into older corridors, illegal party rooms that bloom and wilt like mushrooms in the dark. Only a ribbon of it is curated and safe, a stage set for the public to feel they have touched the underworld and can return unaltered. The rest of it is porous and mean, with sudden shafts and drowned corners and passages that look like others until they're not. A compass points north. A heart points to the place a person hopes is the way back. Hours disappear underground even when you carry a watch. Claire took the photographs she had imagined and a few she had not. Mark holding two candles like a saint pretending to be a surveyor. A wall where someone had arranged femurs to frame a skull that smiled too much. A corridor vanishing into black. A hand, hers, held to the lens like a small moon. They followed the soot marks she drew with a candle as if desire could be made into a trail you could see on the way out. It works until it doesn't. Wax tears, flame gutters, a wall looks like itself in four directions at once. At some point the floor changed, slicker with seep, and they chose left because left looked like the version of the map that made sense. They were not the first to choose left for that reason. In a space like that, a wrong choice works itself into a system. A little more water meant a little more hesitation, meant a little more time, and a little more fuel spent. Their banter got quieter. The air cooled. Somewhere, water knocked like a knuckle against stone. No one above realized anything was wrong until the second day, which is how things go in cities where life is both close and far. Claire's mother called and got no answer. Mark's father stopped by the apartment and found the postcards, the stack of invitation drafts with autumn blank where a date should go, and two mugs with coffee circles inside them. He stood a long time looking at the camera case by the door. He called a friend in the prefecture. The friend called a firefighter who knew which gates to open when the city had to go into the earth. The first search lasted 6 hours. Men who had learned how to pace themselves underground followed the obvious corridors, coughed into the dust, turned their ankles deliberately instead of suddenly, and found nothing. They did find wax on a ledge that flaked under a finger, and a line of soot low along a wall, and a lump of candle that had collapsed upon itself like a burned flower. Recent, the firefighter said, and he might as well have said alive, because this is how hope translates when oxygen is an accounting problem. More searches followed with more men, then dogs. They chalked open doors and chalked walls and mapped with tape measures because GPS does not keep promises at that depth. They used the formal ossuary as a base to count time and breaths. They sent one team to the south galleries and another to the old galleries that the quarrymen had left without signage when the city was young enough to gamble with its future. What they learned was that there is no such thing as enough light to see everything you need to see underground. What they found were scraps of ordinary life moved out of context. A rusted cap from a bottle, a torn page from a magazine that had kept its perfume decades longer than it had kept its color, a matchstick bitten so a nervous mouth wouldn't waste it. The papers wrote about them by the end of the week because Paris likes stories where love and danger are evenly matched. The phrase, lovers lost beneath the city, sat beside photographs of the legitimate ossuary tourists know, the neat stacks of bones, and the engraved warnings that sound like sermons. The families begged for caution and for speed in the same breath. The prefecture refused, politely, to send more teams deeper into uncharted corridors because the city cannot risk many lives for two unless it has to. And in the calculus of governments, everyone is irreplaceable until he is not. Claire's mother left milk and bread on the kitchen counter because grief makes puppets out of hands. Mark's father filed papers and underlined phrases and pressed his thumb against his own map until the paper softened. By the 12th day, the searches grew smaller and more formal, which is to say they grew closer to the state's resignation. The last official team came up white with dust and said the thing no one wanted to say. There are walls down there that have not moved in centuries and walls that moved last winter. There are rooms the size of theaters and cracks the size of a throat. There are flooded quarries you cannot measure without drowning your tape. The file took on the word disparu, disappeared, which is an active verb in French, as if the missing had done something in order to become the thing they now were. Time broadened. It did not heal. It did what time does. It carried the next set of headlines, and then a smaller set after that, and then none, and left the families with the work people do when they're dead are unburied. A light burned in a window for a year and then did not. A plant in a kitchen went through 3 lives and 2 pots. Friends married and felt their happiness knock against the place where Claire and Mark had left theirs on hold. The university mailroom forwarded one last packet of photographs Claire had submitted for a competition no one ever told her she didn't win. Mark's colleagues divided his drafting pencils the way foot soldiers divide cigarettes. The city shifted its weight over the tunnels. Under the city, other lives went on too. Cataphiles built bars underground and then built fences around them to keep the wrong police out. Someone strung electric wire from a line no one was authorized to tap and ran a film screening in a room where a quarryman had died in 1783 from a collapse. Police raided and confiscated and set warning signs. More warning signs were laughed at and more parties were held. An anonymous note left on a wooden bench deep in a chamber read, in neat block letters, "Stop searching. The catacombs keep their own." People said it was a dare, or a confession, or a bit of theater written by a boy who liked how words looked where they didn't belong. There were stories, because of course there were. A man said he had seen a woman's shadow move when there was no lamplight to cast it. A girl swore she had heard a voice say gauche at a crossing when she should have turned left and did not. 3 teenagers claimed they found a camera years later and developed film with half images on it, faces melted by time to streaks. But when pressed to show the prints, their stories melted too. Graffiti turned the names into a vow. Claire plus Mark pour toujours. For always. In the official ossuary, a guide pressed her lips together and told the cleaned-up version because tourists paid for stories that folded well into sleep. In the forbidden tunnels, men with boots too expensive for the mud told dirty versions because fear likes company more than it likes truth. 18 years passed like a sentence deliberately spoken slow. The city changed out its mayors and mended its streets, and added new lines to its maps that didn't help underground. At the surface, Park Montsouris stayed green, and watchdogs run circles beneath chestnut trees. Below it, a group of young explorers in March of 2013 chose a crawlspace that did not look like much and kept at it, because persistence is a way of making luck. They fought the kind of cold that makes a body negotiate with itself, slithered through a section where the ceiling tried to rub their helmets off, and found themselves in a room that looked like a throat had opened into a small lung. The chamber was nothing to a tourist. To a cata, it was perfect. Untagged walls, an old inspection plaque, and a floor that told a story. Wax had pooled in circles and then hardened into pale coins. A backpack had long ago lost its fabric and remembered its shape only in the metal frame collapsed on its side. A small rusted tripod lay where someone's hand had decided it was unnecessary to carry the extra weight another meter. On the stone by the wall, a thin loop of cord lay beside two gold rings still tied to each other the way someone had tied them in 1995. The engraving was faint, but the letters could be read with a lamp and a kiss of breath to make fog. C plus M, 1995. The explorers did the sensible and the generous thing. They photographed the rings in situ, placed them where police could find them, and told no one their names. Anonymous on a forum, someone wrote, "We found something that belongs to the living," and posted coordinates that were almost but not exactly correct because anonymity is a habit, not just a choice. A detective who had once been the friend at the prefecture of Mark's father read the post and felt old enough to laugh and young enough to run. The rings reached a lab, not because gold tells secrets, but because it was necessary to be certain that a city's bureaucracy had done the simple work of matching engravings to the receipt an old jeweler still kept in a file that smelled like tobacco. The jeweler remembered Mark as polite and serious, and Claire is more interested in the light in his shop than in his cases. There were no bones in that room and none in the next. Beyond it lay a wall that had fallen in a way that suggested it had been reminded of gravity only a few years before. The city sent one team down in suits meant more for industrial accidents than for archaeology, and they tapped, measured, listened, and shook their heads. A collapse like that is not a door you can reopen without changing the conditions of the entire house. Theories harden like wax. The clean one is always accident. An error in the old map. Two corridors that forked just at the edge of the lamp beam. A small rockfall that became a large one. Air that thinned and a heart that refused to race when it needed to. The darker one is always people. A door shut, a ladder pulled. A threat made by men whose faces never get written down because the kind of men who carry threats into the dark do not put their names in registers. But the chamber said nothing except what it had already said, and what the rings could say had been said by the jeweler's book. When the families were called, a clerk with a voice too practiced tried to be careful. Claire's mother touched the rings like a person touches a child's hair in a photograph. She kissed them and wept, and put them in a small velvet box that had once held earrings and now held the weight of sentences no one had finished. Mark's father ran his finger under lines in the report, objets trouves, and then asked for pages that did not exist. He had the expression of a man inventorying a house after a fire and discovering that the list of what is missing is the same thing as the list of what is gone. The city reopened the file for 3 months because that is how you respect the dead when there aren't any bodies. Investigators took statements from cataphiles who would not give their names, and from a retired inspector who remembered a plaque with numbers no one else remembered, and from a man who claimed he had met the couple at a bar the week before and warned them not to go. In a conference room with bad coffee, A geologist explained how water undermines stone with a patience no human shares. In a kitchen, a sister explained to a cousin how grief undermines hope with a patience that may be the only thing humans have in common with water. Above ground, the story flared again. A headline does not resist romance. Wedding rings found after 18 years. A columnist wrote about love and the city and the way both are treacherous because they ask you to trust them while they are busy being themselves. A television program sent a crew to the official ossuary and filmed bones pretending to help tell a story that had not happened in that section at all. A guide invented a tasteful epilogue for tourists. The rings had been found, and somehow that meant that certain doors could be shut gently. The guide did not mean to be cruel. Guides are paid to escort people back to the surface. Under the surface, graffiti bloomed again along the illegal paths. Some of it was obscene because boys are, and some of it was an attempt at respect. Two interlocked circles, the C and the M drawn with care like initials in a school notebook. In one narrow place a hand had written, in a different tenderness from the old dare, "We remember you." The letters would last until someone wrote over them, because nothing eternal deserves to be kept in chalk. There were new legends. There always are. One said a camera lay still in a chamber so far from any map that maps refuse to say aloud how far they go. Another said a narrow room at a cross corridor had the sound of two people breathing if you stood in it alone and shut off your lamp. A third said that if you left two rings on the ledge where the wax coins were, the room would return to you an answer in the form of a dream. People are good at building machines out of fear and calling them rituals. No one brought rings except the foolish and the newly in love and men who were both. In 2015, a young policeman who had joined the service because of a case his uncle had never stopped talking about went down with a kata he trusted just enough to follow. He came up with nothing but a cough and the sense that the city is made of layers a person should not pretend to know all at once. He married the woman he had been seeing, and their invitations had a photograph taken on a bridge, and no one had to lie about where the light came from. Paris above continued with its brightness, which is not a lie if you agree not to check under it too often. Weddings happened in gardens where old trees kept leaves wider than hands, and brides frowned because the wind had opinions about veils. Photographers coaxed grooms into looking less like men who were trying to remember vows and more like men who knew things would be fine. People took walks and did not fall into holes in the ground because the city had learned how to cover most of them with concrete and a story about safety. Lovers passed the official catacombs entrance and did not notice the sign that repeats itself in 7 languages. Do not stray from the path. Sometimes Claire's mother takes the rings from the box and warms them in her palm so that gold remembers what blood feels like. She does not speak to them, which is a kind of bravery. She does not ask them to carry meanings they cannot bear. She sets them down on a table and sits and lets a day be a day. Sometimes Mark's father stares at the photocopied map that once made sense to his son and thinks of adding a mark where he knows the mark should go now, and does not, because to admit that the mark belongs on a place you will never see is to hand the darkness the last line of a conversation. The last thing the story can give you is what it took from itself on purpose, an ending shaped like a door left slightly ajar. There is no official closure to stamp here. There are rings and wax and a cord and a tripod and a list of objects too ordinary to be relics and too sacred to be trash. There is the knowledge that a city's underworld is not merely a metaphor, and that people who loved each other very much tried to make a photograph and made a legend instead. There is the way your own breath sounds if you hold it in a stairwell and pretend you are listening for water. There is the reminder that love is brave in the wrong directions as often as it is brave in the right ones. They went down into the catacombs to take a photograph. They did not come back. 18 years later, the underworld returned the smallest proof that it had known them. Two gold rings tied together, their engravings thinned by time, their circles still unbroken. Paris went on shining. The tunnels went on being themselves. Between the two cities, a story hung like a lamp held at arm's length, small, steady, and inadequate to the dark it tried to name.